Last week, we started this series with the story of how our kidding system evolved, from show goats and January barn kidding through commercial Boers, and then the Spanish goats arriving and refusing to work in the system we'd been running for years. Today is part 2, and this is where we get into what that shift actually took. How do you move a herd that's been bred for intensive management towards something completely different? What does culling look like when you're selecting for a new system? And how long before you actually see the results? Let's get to it. Hey there, welcome to GoatWise. I'm Millie Bradshaw, animal scientist and rancher. Here we talk meat goats, feeding strategies, goat fencing, and livestock management that holds up in real life. If you care about raising goats well and building systems that actually work, you're in the right place. Let's talk livestock. If this series has been useful, the best thing you can do right now is leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Scroll down to ratings and reviews, tap the stars, and leave a few sentences. It helps more serious livestock producers find the show, and I read every one of them. And go grab the free kidding due date chart at goatwise.com/kidding-chart. That also gets you on the email list, which is where I share things I'm not putting on the podcast. The link is in the show notes. Part 3 drops next week, and that one is the decision-making framework, how to figure out the right system for your operation. Here's what's happening on the ranch this week. We got 3 inches of snow early last week, and the timing was pretty good. The grass is coming along well, and that moisture gave it a nice boost. We'll be moving the does into the kidding pasture soon. We like to give them a few days to settle in, get comfortable with the space, get sorted out with all 3 livestock guardian dogs before the first kids arrive. I expect we'll see some early kids on the ground around Wednesday. The back-ordered tags are supposed to arrive Tuesday, just in time if everything goes according to plan. I'll be getting those organized, cleaning out the kidding bucket, and getting it restocked, and then we should be ready. There's always a little bit of last-minute scramble before the kids hit the ground, but we're close. We also had another calf born last week, a bull calf out of one of our first calf heifers. Both of them are doing great. Stacy is busy with fence work, and jobs are starting to stack up, which is a good problem to have. I may be fencing for a while so we can get the deadline jobs done on time. I don't love building fence like Stacy does, but I can help. Darcy and I loaded up her goats and headed to show camp last week. This was our 7th year, and it was just as good as the ones before it. The kids always come home having learned a lot, and this year was no different. It's one of those things that's worth it every time. If you caught part 1 last week, you heard the evolution story. Show goats, January barn kidding, the commercial Boers that fit right into the system we had, and then the Spanish does that arrived and flat refused to be willing participants in that system. And what I left you with was the number I'm most proud of from this whole shift. We went from giving every kid a prophylactic dose of antibiotic to giving 0 prophylactic antibiotics. Not by finding a better protocol, by removing the system that was generating the problem in the first place. Today, I want to get into what that actually required, because the story of how we got there is one thing, the work behind it is another. Let's start with what the Boers were actually dealing with when we made the switch to pasture kidding. Those does came from herds that had been raised over generations in barn kidding systems. That's what they knew. That's what their mothers knew, and their mothers before that. They had learned, the way animals learn, through repetition and expectation, that kidding meant confinement. It meant pens, it meant people, it meant intervention. That was normal. And when you ask an animal to step away from an expectation that's been reinforced over that many generations, you're not just asking it to behave differently, you're asking it to unlearn something deeply ingrained. The Spanish does came into our herd without any of that. They experienced barn confinement as a threat, not a management tool. That's why putting them in the barn created the mothering problems we talked about last week. Their instinct was telling them that they were in danger, and you cannot have a productive kidding in that state. But here's the other side of that. Once we stopped trying to put them in the barn and just let them do what their instincts were telling them to do, they were extraordinary. They went and found a secluded spot, kidded quietly, got their kids up, and handled the whole process without us. They were showing us what naturally occurring behavior looks like when you don't override it. They were a mirror, and once we saw what was reflected in that mirror, we could not unsee it. So, when we made the decision to pasture kid the Boers alongside the Spanish, we knew going in that it wasn't going to look clean the first year. You don't undo decades of breeding and management expectation in one kidding season. What we were starting was a process, and you have to have patience for a process. The first year, some of the Boers struggled. Some surprised us, went out, found a spot, kidded well, handled it on their own. Others had their kids and walked away. The instinct wasn't strong enough to carry them through without the structure they were used to. The barn was the cue that said, this is where you settle in and mother, and without that cue, they didn't know what to do. Some needed intervention anyway. We watched all of it, and we took note of who was who. Year 2. Fewer struggled. The does that had succeeded the first year did even better the second year. Their daughters from that first pasture kidding season were not bred, but they were in the pasture with them, experiencing kidding season by watching the other does. They'd never seen a barn kidding pen, never had that expectation built in. After year 2, we culled heavily. This is year 3, and we'll see how those first doe kids that have never been in the barn handle their first kidding. I'm confident they'll do well. The Boer herd is genuinely capable on pasture. They've adapted. The ones that couldn't adapt are gone from the herd. That is selection pressure doing what selection pressure does. I want to be specific about what culling looked like in practice because I think people sometimes assume culling always means the end of their life. What it actually looked like for us was finding homes that were a good fit for the does that weren't adjusting to our pasture system. A doe that required intervention at kidding, that couldn't mother reliably on pasture, that struggled in the system we were building, that doe went to an owner who was barn kidding. Because she was not a bad goat, she just wasn't the right fit for our system. In a barn setup with the right level of management, she is a perfectly functional animal. That's exactly where she went. We weren't discarding genetics, we were sorting them to the system they were suited for. What we were keeping and breeding from were the does that figured it out. The ones that went and found a quiet place in the pasture, kidded, got their kids up and nursing, and handled the whole thing without us. Those genetics moved forward. And every year we require that behavior. Every year we cull the ones that can't produce it. The profile of the herd shifts. It was a huge change in management, and many of the does adapted surprisingly well. In just a few years, the Boer herd is genuinely different from the one we started with. That's selection pressure, and it compounds. The does that thrive on pasture raise daughters that have never known anything else. Those daughters don't have anything to unlearn. They just do what their mothers did in the environment they were born into. Their daughters will do the same. The behavior that took decades to train in one direction gets trained out, one generation at a time, as long as you hold the pressure consistently. Now, here's something I want to say plainly, because it matters a lot for how you set expectations when you're building your own herd toward a lower input system. The fastest way to get there is to start with the right goats. If you can find animals that already come from low input, pasture kidding lines, animals that have been selected for the system you want to run, not the system you're moving away from, you will get there faster. Ask a lot of questions when you're buying. Where did these animals come from? How are they managed? Were they barn kidded? Were they pasture kidded? How long has that operation been selecting toward low input management? Those questions tell you how much unlearning is going to have to happen, and that is a real variable in your timeline. If you start with the right goats, you can grow faster and you won't be culling as hard in those early years. If you start with goats that need to adapt, and sometimes you do because you take what you can get and build from there, you will be culling harder and herd size growth will be slower in the early going. Both paths work. We've done it both ways, but knowing which path you're on helps you set realistic expectations so you're not discouraged when year 1 or year 2 is harder than you thought it would be. The bigger picture here is that behavior can be reshaped, at least to some degree. People sometimes talk about their genetics as a fixed ceiling, and sometimes that's accurate. But what's often missing from that conversation is that selection pressure is real, it is a tool, and it compounds over time. Behavior that was trained in can be trained out. It's not permanent. It takes patience, and it takes a genuine willingness to let animals go that don't fit the direction you're moving. But it works. You point the herd in a direction, you hold that selection pressure, and the performance of the herd shifts toward it over time. And that's the end of part 2. Next week is episode 112, part 3. And that's where we zoom out and give you the framework to think through your own kidding system. Not what we do, but how to evaluate your own genetics, your weather window, your business model, your predator situation, and your labor capacity, and make the decisions that fit your operation. See you next week. Hey there, thanks for listening today. If this episode was helpful, share it with another producer who's raising goats. And if you haven't already, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more serious livestock owners find the show. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for veterinary advice. I'll see you next week here on GoatWise.